Dawn broke over the Sicilian airstrip like a curse light enough to be seen, dim enough to invite attack. Craters pockmarked the runway, courtesy of a midnight Luftwaffe raid. The gravel-laced tarmac steamed with the last of the night's rain. Men moved without speaking. The silence wasn't reverent. It was tense. They all knew what was coming. More bombers, more fighters, more steel screaming from the sky. Lieutenant Clyde Dawson stared down the ruined airfield from the cockpit of his P-47 Thunderbolt. His squadron was grounded. Every plane sat idle, choked by the impossibility of physics. Not enough runway, too much weight, too little lift. Yet Dawson's canopy was closed. His engine was hot, and the mechanic leaning against a sandbag wall was grinning like he'd just lit a fuse. "Ray," Dawson said into the intercom, "you swear this flap won't shear off mid-climb?" "Nope," Ray Holloway crackled back. "But it'll lift you. Like the devil just kicked you in the ass." Most would call that insane. But then again, most hadn't seen Holloway's work, an illegal flap mod soldered together from busted actuators, tail fins, and a spare hydraulic core lifted off a wrecked British Spitfire. It wasn't approved. It wasn't tested. But it was ready. At 0511 hours, Dawson slammed the throttle forward. The P-47 roared, nose tipping upward before the tail even twitched. There was no roll, no gain of speed across the tarmac. The plane bucked, then leapt nose first into the sky at a near-vertical climb. Ground crews ducked. One man dropped his coffee. Another whispered, "What the hell?" At 150 feet, the airframe began to rattle. At 300, the P-47 was nearly perpendicular to the ground. At 600, it snapped into a high loop and disappeared into the clouds. It wasn't supposed to happen. Physics didn't allow for it. And yet it had just occurred in full view of a German reconnaissance unit watching from a ridgeline 2 miles north. One soldier adjusted his binoculars, blinked, then reached for his field phone. Amerikaner Thunderbolt. It went up, straight up, like a rocket. Yes, I am sober. What they witnessed that morning wasn't a fluke. It wasn't luck. It was a wrench-forged rebellion against the limits of engineering. The Allies had always relied on runway, on length, on space to gain speed. But this was something new, something terrifying. A prop fighter climbing like a missile. And nobody, not the Germans, not even the Americans, understood what had just been born. In the coming weeks, Luftwaffe pilots would write furious after-action reports, trying to describe the impossible. A P-47 with no roll, no delay, just vertical aggression. They'd call it ghost tech, prototype madness, aerodynamic nonsense. But back on the Sicilian airfield, as the dust settled and the crews tried to process what they had just seen, Holloway just nodded. "It works," he said. "Let's build another." Because on that cratered runway, in a corner of a war that had already burned too bright for too long, a myth had launched into the sky. And it was just getting started. From the first day of flight school to the final mission briefings of World War II, one truth reigned supreme. Fighters need a runway. Wings need airflow. Lift needs speed. And no propeller aircraft, no matter how powerful, could ever defy that holy sequence. First you roll, then you rise. Vertical takeoff was the stuff of pulp science fiction rockets and dreams. In 1943, no engineer in their right mind would sketch such a thing onto a fighter design. Even the Germans, with their exotic jets and swept-wing ambitions, accepted the runway as gospel. And yet, what if someone didn't? Allied doctrine was strict. Field manuals dictated flap angles, lift profiles, and tolerances down to the millimeter. Maintenance crews were drilled to follow procedure, not rewrite it, especially not with something as sensitive and lethal as lift surfaces. Flaps were tools for stability, not chaos. They were deployed during takeoff and landing to increase lift at low speeds, not to reverse the laws of acceleration. Overextend a flap, and you risk structural failure. Twist its angle beyond factory limits, and the airflow breaks. Instead of flying, you tumble. But mechanics like Ray Holloway didn't have the luxury of dogma. He had a dozen damaged airframes, a crate of mismatched parts, and pilots begging for a miracle. Every runway bombed, every mission delayed, every minute on the ground an invitation to death. So he started asking dangerous questions. What if the flap didn't just increase lift but changed the aircraft's vector entirely? What if, instead of rolling for speed, we could angle for altitude, right off the throttle? Every pilot laughed. A P-47 climbing vertically? Absurd. The Thunderbolt was a flying brick, durable, heavy, fast in a dive, but no ballet dancer in the sky. The idea of it rising like a missile sounded like suicide, until it worked. But the misconception ran deeper than just disbelief. It was woven into Allied production lines, flight theory, even airfield design. Everything assumed horizontal space was available, that the ground could always provide the first 1,000 feet of motion. That air combat was a matter of run and rise. And that's exactly what the Luftwaffe expected too. The Germans knew their advantage. They bombed runways precisely because they knew how badly the Allies depended on them. No runway meant no sortie. No sortie meant no air cover. That math worked until Holloway rewrote it. When the first modified P-47 lifted off vertically in Sicily, it didn't just stun the observers. It cracked the illusion that World War II flight had settled into predictable parameters. Suddenly, the Germans weren't fighting by the book, they were fighting against hacks, field tricks, and machines that broke rules in ways their aces couldn't anticipate. In post-war debriefs, Luftwaffe veterans would recall phantom climbs, planes that came from nowhere, and American fighters jumping like fleas. It was dismissed as battlefield confusion, until radar logs and gun camera footage confirmed the trajectory, not horizontal, but vertical. The idea that a Thunderbolt could skip the runway and go airborne in seconds, that was a punchline. Then it became a tactic, and finally, a nightmare. Because once you question gravity and win, you force the enemy to question everything. Sicily in mid-1943 was a graveyard of airfields. Allied engineers arrived to find asphalt peeled up like fruit skins, craters sunk into every runway, and entire stretches of landing strips blown into dust by nightly Luftwaffe raids. The message was clear. Planes don't fly without roads, and roads don't last under fire. Each morning, the air crews of the 64th Fighter Wing played the same game, rush to patch the strip, refuel, rearm, and launch fighters before the bombers came back. Each evening, they watched smoke bloom from the same holes, with bodies and busted landing gear scattered among the debris. The war was outpacing their capacity to fix it. And the P-47 Thunderbolt, for all its battlefield reputation, wasn't built for this. It was a warhammer, not a scalpel, 10 tons of steel and firepower that needed space to roll and speed to lift. The aircraft's minimum takeoff run was 1,200 feet under combat load. That meant any crater wider than a football field could ground an entire squadron. After 3 days of bombing near Gerbini Airfield, the longest unbroken stretch of flat ground measured just 260 feet. Logistical desperation followed. Bulldozers worked around the clock. Steel planking, Marston mat, was flown in from Malta, but there wasn't enough to cover even one fighter strip. Portable catapults were suggested but quickly dismissed as impractical and dangerous for prop aircraft. Meanwhile, the kill rate soared not in the air, but on the ground. In a single week, 9 Thunderbolts were lost attempting takeoff. None were shot down. All were torn apart by terrain that no longer cooperated. Field commanders begged for alternatives. More airfields, faster repairs, lighter loads. But HQ could offer none. The only thing they had in surplus was damaged parts and mechanics with nothing to lose. Ray Holloway wasn't the only one improvising in this chaos. but he was the only one reckless enough to tinker with lift flaps. He watched the runway shrink and realized that asking the plane to accelerate forward wasn't going to work. The geometry had to flip. The force of takeoff had to be redirected, not outward, but upward. Inside a sandbag bunker, he stripped down the P-47's hydraulic lines and modified the actuator limiters. Using a repurposed Spitfire piston and a valve assembly from a B-25, he overclocked the flap's extension range far beyond its designed angle. The standard 35-degree flap was pushed toward 60, then 70. He installed a locking lever so the flap wouldn't retract automatically. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't sanctioned. But it was the only way to manufacture lift without distance. And the location made it necessary. The Gerbeny sector became ground zero for makeshift innovation, not because of any special brilliance, but because there was simply no other choice. The enemy controlled the skies, and the ground was broken. That was the backdrop. Mechanics on borrowed time, working inside shattered hangars, surrounded by dying planes and frustrated pilots. The mission board filled with canceled sorties. Bombers flew with no cover. Pilots wrote final letters without ever getting airborne. Until Holloway's suicidal flap hack gave them one more chance. The ground couldn't support a normal launch. But what if the ground didn't matter? One by one, the Thunderbolts were fitted with the altered mechanism at first, secretly, then with quiet permission from squad leaders desperate to get any plane into the air. The first test flight ended in a blown tire. The second lifted 20 feet and fell. The third, that was Dawson's flight, the one that changed everything. The takeoff strip wasn't rebuilt. It was bypassed. The plane didn't adapt to the field. It ignored it entirely. This wasn't about speed anymore. It was about angle and audacity. The P-47 Thunderbolt was a Beast 8, 50 caliber guns, a maximum speed over 430 miles per hour, and the structural integrity to dive like a falling anvil. But all of that meant nothing on a cratered runway. It didn't matter how powerful your engine was if the wheels snapped before you even left the ground. The numbers told a brutal truth: 1,200 feet. That's the minimum runway length a fully loaded P-47 needed for takeoff in combat conditions. That figure assumed ideal ground, smooth weather, and a properly tuned airframe. In Sicily, none of those applied. After a week of bombing, average usable runway length dropped to 290 feet. That wasn't short. That was suicidal. 22% of attempted P-47 takeoffs during the Gerbeny campaign ended in mechanical failure or crashes on the ground. And those that did manage to lift off did so with compromised trajectories and at dangerously low altitudes. Perfect targets for lurking German fighters. Flap integrity under stress became a critical failure point. The standard P-47 flaps were rated to sustain aerodynamic loads only up to 38 degrees. But when desperate pilots began abusing the system, forcing them wider for quicker lift, structural reports logged 9 complete flap ruptures per month across the Sicilian theater alone. Every one of those failures ended the same way: an aborted takeoff, a shattered propeller, and often a dead pilot. Speed wasn't the issue anymore. Even when engines screamed at full throttle, there just wasn't enough room to convert velocity into lift. Acceleration was never the bottleneck. It was angle, no matter how hard they pushed. The planes ran out of ground before they ever reached flight. It wasn't just the Thunderbolt. P-42s, Spitfires, even the agile A-36s, all suffered the same fate. Aircraft designed for dynamic takeoffs now faced the battlefield equivalent of a parking lot. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe exploited it mercilessly. Their recon planes tracked the crater patterns. Their bombers returned at intervals, carefully timed to catch ground crews mid-repair. And their fighters learned to strike just as Allied pilots began their rollout, gunning down planes that barely had time to breathe. Pilots wrote letters to families they never expected to see again. "If I can't get airborne in the next 2 days," one wrote, "I'd rather go out swinging than sitting." The Americans needed a new equation. Ray Holloway provided one. Lift, not roll. Angle, not speed. Height, not length. His crude actuator mod dismissed as madness offered exactly that. Instead of gambling on horizontal acceleration, he rerouted the bet to vertical pressure. The flap reconfiguration didn't just help, it transformed takeoff physics. One field test with Dawson's Thunderbolt clocked the liftoff point at less than 80 feet of forward travel. That was 93% shorter than factory specs. Climb data from that same launch recorded a 0-600-foot ascent in just 3.1 seconds, more aggressive than some early jet prototypes. And the kicker? Enemy fighters, trained to strike on rollout, missed their window entirely. In one engagement, logged days later, a German May 109 squadron failed to engage fast enough, reacting 4.7 seconds too late. Not enough time to lock, aim, or climb. The numbers were more than statistics. They were declarations. The math of traditional flight had collapsed. Every assumption about takeoff, timing, range, survivability was shattered by a single forbidden modification. Suddenly, the question wasn't if you could launch from a broken runway. It was whether the enemy could catch you before you vanished into the clouds. The 9th of July, 1943. Operation Husky was hours from launch, and chaos brewed beneath the surface. The Allies were about to initiate one of the largest amphibious assaults of the war. 180,000 troops storming Sicily's shores, backed by air cover that barely existed. Gerbini Airfield, now reduced to a minefield of debris and hope, held 4 operational P-47 Thunderbolts. Of those, only 2 were airworthy enough to fly with full armament, and only one had Ray Holloway's modified vertical lift flap system. Lieutenant Clyde Dawson volunteered without hesitation. The mission: provide top cover for paratrooper drops along Sicily's southeast coast. The problem: Luftwaffe fighters had flooded the region, and any American bird that struggled off the ground would be slaughtered within seconds. But Dawson's Thunderbolt didn't struggle. It screamed. At 4-3, under a shroud of low fog and scattered flak, Dawson taxied just 30 feet forward, far shorter than standard. His P-47 jolted upward like a thrown spear. The nose pointed nearly vertical. And then, it disappeared. The ground crew didn't cheer. They held their breath. 3 minutes later, a garbled voice came across the radio. 3 bogies. High left. Engaging. The Luftwaffe had been patrolling the coastal approach, waiting for slow-moving transports and struggling escorts. Instead, they met a climbing demon. Dawson didn't level out. He ascended into their path, blazing straight toward them like a projectile launched from the earth. Me 109 seconds weren't built for vertical reaction time. They relied on speed, turns, and energy retention. But Dawson gave them no time to calculate. He flew through their formation, tore into one with 2 50-cal rounds, then inverted into a drop that put him behind the second before they could scatter. 2 kills in under 12 seconds. The third fled toward the northeast, toward more Luftwaffe territory, but Dawson didn't chase. He had a new heading: the inbound transport column. By 4:19, he was flying escort for 3 C-47 Skytrains full of paratroopers. 2 more P-47 seconds had barely lifted off from the broken airstrip by then. One nearly crashed. The other limped into altitude, arriving minutes behind Dawson. But none of that mattered, because the Germans didn't expect him. They didn't see where he came from. Radio intercepts later revealed Luftwaffe chatter describing an Allied fighter rising from nowhere, too high, too fast, and impossible flight vector. Dawson's gun camera footage confirmed the impossible. The climb to target angle was so steep, it appeared he had launched from midair. After-action reports credited him with 4 confirmed kills, 2 unconfirmed, and 0 friendly losses under his protection. His fuel logs showed an 11-minute sortie with 80% ammunition expenditure and a top climb rate clocked at over 5,000 feet per minute during initial liftoff. But the real success wasn't the kill count. It was the fact that, for the first time in days, a Thunderbolt had left that airstrip and returned intact. Later that afternoon, Holloway's modified flap design was approved for 9 more airframes. His workbench was moved closer to the tarmac. For once, brass stopped asking questions. They just wanted results. And pilots? They stopped laughing. Because after Dawson's flight, the joke had flipped. The same men who mocked the suicidal flap now begged to be next. The moment Lieutenant Clyde Dawson's Thunderbolt launched vertically into the sky, the math of World War II air combat began to collapse not on paper, but on the battlefield. Air power wasn't supposed to be this unpredictable. The equations had been stable for years. Runway length plus engine thrust equaled flight time. Takeoff lag dictated enemy reaction. Every plan, every tactic, every interception relied on those constants. Now, the constants were dead. In a single 12-minute sortie, Dawson proved that a fighter could bypass horizontal rollout entirely. That revelation didn't just shift local tactics, it torched the Luftwaffe's timing model across Sicily. German pilots were trained to target rollout windows. Their best chance at a kill was when the Allied fighters were low, slow, and linear, vulnerable during takeoff. But Dawson's launch erased that window. His vertical lift meant he entered the combat altitude envelope faster than the Me. 109 seconds could climb to match him. That broke the first link in the chain. Then came the ripples. Within 48 hours, Allied squadrons across 3 separate airstrips began requesting Holloway's flap modifications. At least 5 Thunderbolts were retrofitted by hand, using blueprints sketched in chalk on the side of a hangar wall. These vertical birds, as pilots began calling them, launched in a staggered pattern, one every 20 minutes, each punching upward from shattered airfields the Luftwaffe considered inoperable. This sudden burst of launch capability sparked a domino effect in the air war. Recon patrols previously grounded for lack of safe takeoff zones were suddenly airborne. Strafing missions resumed. Bombers that had flown blind were now shielded by at least partial escort. In just 3 days, Allied air presence over southeast Sicily jumped by 22%. Not because of new reinforcements, but because dead planes had become operational through a forbidden trick. And the Germans noticed. Intercept patterns began to miss their targets entirely. Me-262 jets launched on intelligence 2 hours old, arriving to find no enemy or too late escorts. One Luftwaffe ace described his shock in a captured letter. They appear in the clouds as if grown from the mist. No smoke, no sound, until they dive. Radar logs confirmed the phenomenon. Previously, Allied fighters were tracked at 100 feet, 200 feet, then rising slowly across a mile of runway. Now, radar signatures emerged, already climbing at 800 feet with no forward vector. It was as if they had materialized from the sky. That illusion crushed morale on the German side. Elite fighter groups tasked with intercepting slow climbs were suddenly facing aircraft already at engagement, altitude, armed, climbing, and aggressive. And the Luftwaffe's commanders didn't understand why. They launched inquiries, suspecting a new engine type. Some believed the Allies had introduced a rocket-boosted version of the P-47. Others feared the arrival of a new British design. What none realized until months later was that it wasn't new tech. It was a mechanic's gamble. Holloway's flap hack wasn't approved by Lockheed, Republic, or any air ministry. It didn't exist in any Allied blueprint. It was born from desperation, and it spread like a virus quietly, locally, through whispered tips and tool trades between mechanics. But the effect was global. One small lift angle change had crippled the enemy's timetable. The Germans now had to guess when and where the next vertical launch might strike. That uncertainty froze decision-making. In some sectors, entire Luftwaffe patrols were delayed by fear of surprise attack. Aerial hesitation became fatal, and the math kept breaking. Because once you remove time from the runway equation, once lift becomes instant, climb becomes immediate, and engagement becomes unavoidable, you're not flying anymore. You're launching. And launching breaks everything. The 17th of July, 1943. Regalbuto Ridge, Central Sicily. An American bomber group was bleeding altitude fast. hit by flak and shredded by strafing passes. 3. B. 25 Mitchells struggled to maintain formation. Their escort, a pair of standard P-42s, had already turned back due to fuel constraints. Ground command scrambled for replacements, but the nearest operational fighter squadron was still 90 miles away. Except for one man. Lieutenant Sam Ellis sat inside his idling P-47, one of Holloway's newly modified vertical climb birds, parked at a forward field with no operational runway. He'd been grounded for days, waiting on a fresh engine. But the patchwork crew finished just hours earlier, and the modified flaps were already installed. When the distress call came in, he didn't hesitate. At 12:03 p.m., with less than 200 feet of forward movement, Ellis lifted off vertically and vanished into the clouds. He climbed at a rate of 5,400 feet per minute, cutting a near-vertical path through the lower atmosphere. His trajectory was so steep that ground control lost radar lock. They assumed the plane had stalled or spiraled out. It hadn't. At 12:07, just 4 minutes after takeoff, Ellis made visual contact with the battered bombers. One trailed smoke. Another had lost an engine. The Luftwaffe squadron was circling for the kill, 5 Mi-109 seconds, playing with their prey, teasing the final strike. Ellis didn't signal. He didn't flank. He rose into the dogfight like a cannon shell. His first burst tore through a Mi-109 before the pilot even realized he was under attack. The German fighter split in two and fell away like confetti. Ellis pulled into a corkscrew ascent, fired blind into the turn, and clipped a second enemy, sending it smoking into the horizon. The remaining three scattered, but Ellis didn't chase. His climb continued high, vertical, defiant. He circled above the bombers like a hawk, daring the Germans to return. They didn't. The B-25 seconds regrouped, their radios filled with disbelief. "Where the hell did you come from? Thanks for watching. When please regroup." "With the Armin," Ellis laughed. "Up!" It wasn't just a joke. It was truth. His arrival vector was too steep to be predicted, too fast to be intercepted. In a war where altitude often decided survival, Ellis had turned climb into a weapon. Command logged his launch to intercept time at 4 minutes 17 seconds. Enemy Kia. 2. Bombers saved. 3. More importantly, the rescue proved that Holloway's modification wasn't just for quick takeoffs, it was a strategic shift. Planes that could climb like rockets could intercept emergencies faster, strike harder, and reset the entire rhythm of combat response. That night, Lieutenant Ellis's modified P-47 was dubbed the Elevator, and across the front, mechanics pulled out blueprints, wrenches, and rivet guns not to repair but to transform. The Allies had discovered a new kind of fighter, one that didn't need a runway, just sky. The 23rd of July 1943. Just outside Monte San Giuliano, the terrain rose into a jagged fortress of cliffs, farmland, and winding valleys. A Luftwaffe squadron of 6 Mi-109 seconds had been spotted loitering above the ridge, picking off Allied supply convoys, trying to move through the narrow passes below. The ground units were trapped roads shelled, air cover scarce, and every movement visible to the circling German hunters. Back at a forward air post barely 15 miles away, a newly formed tactical flight group under Captain Joe Faulkner was prepping for an unrelated reconnaissance sortie. Among the 4 Thunderbolts on the field, 2 had just received the forbidden Holloway flap mods. The other 2 hadn't. The mission changed in an instant. At 13:41, Allied Ground Command received distress calls from supply trucks pinned between strafing runs. The Mi-109 seconds had cut off their retreat route, and the window for air cover was closing. The Germans knew no fighters could launch from the nearby damaged strips in time. They'd been bombing them for days. They didn't know what Faulkner had. Within 90 seconds, Faulkner and Lieutenant Brian Avery, each in a modified P-47, began their ascent. The launch wasn't elegant. The terrain around the strip was rugged, uneven, and dangerous. But the Holloway system didn't care about elegance. It cared about lift. Their Thunderbolts roared up at impossible angles, clearing the treetops with inches to spare. One ground mechanic shouted, "They didn't take off, they exploded upward," climbing hard through the valley mist. Faulkner reached the kill zone in just over 4 minutes. Below him, the chaos was visible even through smoke. German fighters diving in lazy loops, Allied trucks turning into burning husks. No cover, no escape. Then Faulkner dove. He used his vertical momentum not just to gain height, but to convert it into ferocious energy on descent. At 390 miles per hour, he sliced between two Mi-109 seconds mid-turn, spraying both with tracers and splitting their formation in half. Avery followed 6 seconds later, executing a rolling dive that flipped him behind the enemy leader. One clean burst, one kill. The Luftwaffe pilots panicked. Their assumptions had failed. Fighters don't just appear that high, that fast, from that direction. Their practiced loop patterns crumbled. Instead of hunting, they were hunted. Within 40 seconds, 2 more Mi-109 seconds were down. The final pair broke off and sprinted northeast, chased into radar blackout. Faulkner didn't pursue. He pulled up hard and high, banking toward the convoy to perform overwatch. Avery circled wide, daring more Germans to return. They didn't. When the dust cleared, 17 supply trucks had survived what should have been certain destruction. Their drivers later described the moment like divine intervention. "We thought it was the end." Then, thunder split the sky. It wasn't just the kill count, though. 4 Luftwaffe fighters were confirmed destroyed. It was the timing. The entire intercept occurred within 7 minutes of distress call receipt. 7. Not enough time for a traditional scramble. Not enough time for backup. Just enough time for a mechanic's hacked-up lift system to save a convoy. After-action reports began to spread the word. Not official memos, those were still bogged down in approval chains. No. This was word of mouth, pilot to pilot. You get the mod, you win altitude. You win altitude, you own the sky. The lift flap revolution wasn't just about takeoff anymore. It was about control. And in Sicily, control of the sky no longer belonged to the Luftwaffe. It belonged to the ones who could rise from broken earth, straight up, like lightning from the ground. By the end of July 1943, whispers of the vertical launch mod had spread beyond Sicily. From Tunisia to Corsica, across makeshift Allied airfields barely held together with wire and willpower, a strange new phrase began showing up in pilot logbooks: HLW Holloway Lift Wing. At first, commanders dismissed it as a code, or worse, a joke. But behind the abbreviation was a truth that no one in high command had predicted. What had begun as a desperate hack was reshaping combat strategy across entire theaters. The field reports no longer trickled in, they flooded. 37 documented cases of impossible climb angles, 12 confirmed kills from vertical engagement, at least 7 bomber rescues where response time was under 5 minutes, made possible only by Holloway's flap innovation, and hundreds of unofficial reports. Pilots swearing their planes jumped into the air, crews begging their chiefs to allow modifications, just like Faulkner's or like Ellis's bird. Mechanics who once laughed at Holloway now guarded his blueprints like holy relics. Entire squadrons tore into their own wing flaps without waiting for official go-aheads. Why? Because survival was a better argument than protocol. And survival, it turned out, was contagious. What made Holloway's design so powerful wasn't just physics, it was proof. Proof that one mechanic, one wrench, one deviation from the manual could break a stalemate. That innovation didn't come from factories, it came from foxholes. And that if you could climb first, you could hit first. If you could hit first, you could survive. At a secret briefing weeks later, Allied planners reviewed dogfight footage showing near-vertical climbs. Some believed they were looking at prototype rocket interceptors. A general reportedly muttered, "We're not designing these. We're unleashing them." Even the Luftwaffe adjusted. Their jet squadrons were warned. Avoid sudden climbs near P-47 seconds. One captured pilot confessed under interrogation. We don't know which of them can fly straight up now, so we assume all of them. Fear had flipped. The final irony? Holloway never saw himself as a genius. He was a problem solver. When asked why he bent the rules, he simply said, "Because the hill was too short, so I went up instead of out." And that became the doctrine. Because in the sky over Sicily, up wasn't just a direction. It was the answer. The footage of that first vertical climb is long lost. No camera caught Holloway's hacked Thunderbolt leaping skyward like a missile. No radio call perfectly captured the gasps of stunned ground crews or the disbelief in German command posts as radar signals twisted into the impossible. But those who saw it never forgot. They called it a trick, a fluke, a one-off miracle, until more birds rose. One by one, planes that weren't meant to fly like rockets began doing just that. Not from high-tech labs or billion-dollar factories, but from junkyards, tool sheds, and the grease-black hands of mechanics who dared to ask, "What if we try it anyway?" That's the real story. This isn't about a machine. It's about the mechanic, a man surrounded by wreckage, with nothing but scrap metal, faulty flaps, and the kind of mind that rewrites the laws of war when no one's watching. A man who gave pilots a way out straight up when every other direction meant death. Holloway's lift trick didn't change aviation theory. It didn't end the war. But it changed the fight that day. It bought seconds when seconds saved lives. It punched through ceilings no blueprint ever saw coming. And it reminded everyone that sometimes the most powerful weapon is the rule you dare to break. So next time you hear a roar in the sky, think of that P-47, the one that didn't run down the runway. It launched. Because once someone shows the impossible can be done, no one fights the same way again.